Hi everyone, it's Hailey Bachrach here to introduce you to Henry VI Part 3 for the Shakespeare 2020 project. Once again, this play picks up pretty much exactly where the last play left off. Henry VI Part 2 ends with the king losing a battle, and Henry VI Part 3 begins with the Duke of York celebrating winning that same battle. But even though these two scenes clearly come one right after the other, there are other ways in which years seem to have passed between the two plays. But as usual with Shakespeare, it's best just to not worry about that too much and just roll with it. As of this play, the Wars of the Roses have truly begun, and the real focus is on the conflict between the families of York and Lancaster. This was a really important conflict for Shakespeare's period because the real winner of the war between York and Lancaster was neither of those families, but rather the House of Tudor, that is, the family line begun by Elizabeth's grandfather. Some people believe that because of this, and the political delicacy of implying that there was anything wrong with Elizabeth's claim to the throne, the moralities of these plays is a little flatter than later histories. Things are a bit more black and white. I don't actually think that's true. I think that once you begin to read, you realize that these are really complicated plays. All of the characters are doing awful things, but at the same time, almost all of the characters have a moment where the audience is asked to sympathize with them and to try to understand why they're doing the things that they're doing. It's really nuanced and complicated, and once again, I think especially in terms of character, there's a real richness here that's really exciting. It's also a really interesting play when thinking about Shakespeare as a writer. This may well be the play that made him famous. I say this because one of the first references we have to Shakespeare as a professional writer comes in a pamphlet written by another playwright called Robert Greene. You might have heard the quote where he calls Shakespeare an upstart crow. Another thing that he calls Shakespeare in that same pamphlet is a tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide. Now, specifically, that's a reference to the fact that Shakespeare was trying to set himself up as both an actor and a writer, which Greene, who is university educated, along with many of the other prominent playwrights of this period, thought was a little inappropriate and weird. But it's also a version of a quote from Henry VI Part 3. Late in the play, the Duke of York calls Queen Margaret a tiger's heart wrapped in a woman's hide, a reference to the fact that she's behaving so brutally she couldn't possibly be a real woman. There's a lot of gender essentialism in this play, so get ready for that. But in the context of this pamphlet, it raises a really interesting relationship between Shakespeare and Margaret as these sort of parallel transgressive figures. It also suggests that Greene knew perfectly well that by adapting this quote, people would know exactly what writer he was talking about and exactly what play he was quoting from, which suggests in turn that Shakespeare and Henry VI Part 3 had gotten quite famous enough that they could be referenced without explanation, and the writer could count on people knowing who and what play he meant. So there's a really interesting association here between Margaret and Shakespeare's burgeoning fame. Another character associated with Shakespeare's fame that we find in this play is Richard, the son of the Duke of York. Late in this play, he receives the title Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and some of you probably know that he goes on to become King Richard III. That's a character that we know is associated with Shakespeare throughout his career. When Richard Burbage, the lead actor in Shakespeare's company, who played Richard III in the eponymous play and probably played him in this play as well, when he died, Richard was one of the characters who was mentioned in his eulogies as one of the roles that made him famous. So in thinking of Shakespeare's career broadly, this is a really interesting play and one that hopefully you'll begin to see why it made him famous, because I think it's a really exciting, interesting play, and I hope you enjoy it.